to Old Testament Survey. My name is Dr. Tracy Paino, and I will be helping you this semester as we go through the Old Testament, get an introduction, get a big overview, as well as look at some of the specifics of what we would term the Old Testament, the Christian Old Testament. I'm Dr. Tracy Paino. I have been a youth pastor, a college professor, a dean. I have worked for a missions organization. I lead trips to the lands of the Bible, Israel, Jordan, Turkey, Greece, and Italy. I've been doing that for almost 10 years as I lead groups to the lands, and I've been helping teach the online courses for ministry studies online. So it's my pleasure to be able to be your professor for this semester as we look through the Old Testament and get an overview of the Old Testament. I enjoy not just studying the Bible, but asking questions of the Bible, to be able to ask what it is that I'm reading and what does it mean. And before you can understand what it means for you and for me, that we also need to find out what it meant to the original writer, to the audience that the writer was writing to, and what it has meant through the ages. And so we're going to take a look at the Old Testament. As Christians, a lot of times we focus so much on the New Testament, and we are reading through a lens that is 2,500 years or more removed from what transpires in the Old Testament. And we read the Old Testament through that lens of several millennia. And so what we need to do is unpack and dig through some of that filter and some of that lens to find out what the real story, what the real narrative of those words and of those texts and of the story, of God's story is. The Old Testament, of course, is the first part of the Christian Bible. It contains what is essentially the Hebrew Bible, or the Tanakh. This is the Bible of Jesus. When Jesus refers to Scripture, when Jesus is teaching and expounding on Scripture, when he is amazing people and they're telling other people that here is a teacher that is amazing, that is a teacher that has authority, the Scripture that he's using is the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. Of course, the New Testament wasn't written then. The story about Jesus and the early church and the letters from the apostles, they weren't there. The Old Testament was the Bible of the first century. It was the Bible that Jesus used. It was the Bible that his disciples used. It was the Bible the Apostle Paul uses. There are 39 books in the English Protestant canon of the Old Testament. Of course, that number varies depending on your religious background or spirituality. The Catholic Bible has more, the Eastern Orthodox has more, but we have 39 books in the English Protestant canon of the Old Testament. The Hebrew Bible was divided into 3 different sections. The first 5 books was Torah, the law. Then there was a section called the prophets, and sometimes it's divided into the former prophets and the latter prophets. The former prophets compose some of what we would view as some of the historical books. They weren't divided the same way that we divide them in the Protestant canon, but the second section was the prophets in the Hebrew Bible. The third and final section was the writings, and of course this contained the various poetry books, the wisdom literature, the various accounts that are contained there in the Hebrew Bible. The Protestant Old Testament, we divided up into 4 or 5 sections. We begin with the Pentateuch. This is essentially the same 5 books. That's actually Penta is 5, and that's where we get Pentateuch. But this is the same 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, of the Torah, or the law. So sometimes you will hear this referred to as the books of Moses, the law, the Torah, the Pentateuch. It's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. The next section is the history. And that takes us really from when the children of Israel are entering into the promised land, the book of Joshua, as they cross the Jordan River. From that point all the way up to and following the exile, we have the account of the history books of the Old Testament. Then there's the poetry and the wisdom literature, and the prophets follow that. And the prophets sometimes are divided between the major prophets and the minor prophets. And so that's the way we divide it up. We're going to be taking a look at each of these sections, and we're going to take a look, an overview of each of the books of the Old Testament, the 39 books of the Old Testament, as we go through this semester. As you read, as you watch the videos for our lectures, we're going to take each one by one and unpack it so that we have a better understanding of the stories and the meaning behind each of the books of the Old Testament. I always like to give a little bit of my methodology when I'm reading Scripture. And usually when I'm reading Scripture and using this methodology, there's some simple tools that I like to use. But I have a simple methodology. It's not original with me. A professor by the name of Anson Rainey came up with this methodology, or has at least articulated this methodology. Another person who has articulated this is a friend of mine, Dr. Mark Turnage, in a book called Windows into the Bible. He articulates this methodology quite well. And this methodology really gets to the context of Scripture, the context of the narrative of both the Old Testament and the New Testament, but our focus is the Old Testament. In this methodology, how we get to the context, how we understand what the meaning behind the words and the story, what it really is. Before we can ever get to what it means to me, we have to know, what did it mean to the people that it was written by and written for. And so to uncover that context, there's really a four-step process. The first one is place. God reveals himself, and this narrative unpacks at a place. Of course, that place is a very actually small place when you look at the entire world. The stories unfold in the Fertile Crescent, of course, in the land of Israel, the Middle East of today. And it happened in a place, and the place is important. I often ask people when I take them on trips over to Israel is, why did God choose this place? There was a reason. The place is the only character in the Bible that we can actually interact with today. I tell the groups that I guide that oftentimes you hear people talk about, when I get to heaven, I want to sit down and I want to talk to, and you fill in the blank. And it might be one of their favorite Bible characters. It could be somebody from the Old Testament, or usually somebody from the New Testament, that they want to sit down and find out what it was really like. Well, the one character of the Bible that we can still interact with today is the land, the geography, the width and the breadth of the same land that the patriarchs walked, and the same land that each of the characters of the Bible lived in and dealt with and knew. That landscape and that climate, it's the place, and this story unfolds in a real place. It wasn't in a galaxy far, far away, or it wasn't in some other worldly place. It was a place here on this earth, and we can unpack it. That's why I oftentimes, when I'm reading Scripture, I have a Bible atlas, maps right in front of me, so that when there's a place that's mentioned, I want to find it, and I want to see, and I want to look and see if there's a significance as to where the story happens and unfolds. And I'd encourage you to do that as you read through the Old Testament, as you read through the Bible. Don't just pass over those names, but ask yourself, where is that? Oftentimes we can point right to it on a map. And so I encourage you to do that, because God's story encompasses a place. It also encompasses a time. We have to know about history. And we have to understand that this story didn't happen in the 21st century. Oftentimes we tell the story and we try to put ourselves in that story and in our context, but it didn't happen in our time. This story happened 4,000 years ago, 3,500 years ago. It happened a long, long time ago. And that time was not like our time. And we have to understand the time. We have to understand the history. We have to put it in the context of when it happened so that we can find out from that what God was doing in that time and in that place. It also has happened with the people, the culture, a specific people. It wasn't happening in America. It wasn't happening in the Western Hemisphere. It was happening in the Middle East. It happened in a place. It happened in a time. It happened in a certain culture that impacts and tells the story. And the fourth area that it happens in spirituality. The people of the Old Testament especially were not Christians. They were Hebrew. They were Jewish. This is the Jewish ancestors. They come from a different spirituality than what we come from. As a matter of fact, their whole mindset wasn't initially for a monotheistic viewpoint of the world as we have as modern day Christians. They come from a plurality of gods. And so when they talk about that you shall have no other gods before you, we might think that's weird because it's only one God, right? How can they talk about you shall have no other gods? Of course you won't. There's only one God. But in that culture, at that time, in that place, their spirituality encompasses the recognition that there were other gods that people recognized or worshipped in different ways. Although they were false gods, they still had a mindset that was very different than our own. So we have to understand that. Well, we're going to take a look and we're going to begin this journey by looking at those first 5 books of the Old Testament. You're going to be reading through the book of Genesis this week. And in our textbook, you're going to be reading the first several chapters that get you through the book of Genesis. But we're going to be taking a look over the next couple weeks at these first 5 books, what we term the Pentateuch. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Let me give you just a big picture. You're going to dive deep in your textbook and you're going to watch some of the videos, and it's going to hopefully help you make sense better than ever before of when you read the Old Testament. So often I hear people will begin to read the Bible and I'm going to read it from cover to cover. Usually about January 1st they're going to read through it, and they get through Genesis. They start through Exodus and start slogging away. By the time they get to Leviticus, it's pretty well at a crawl, and it's difficult. And they usually give up somewhere in Leviticus or Numbers, or it slows way down. Well, you're going to get a chance this semester to get through the entire Old Testament. I encourage you, take it a little bit at a time. Don't get behind. Try to keep up each week. Make sure you're reading through the assigned text. But we're going to get a big picture of the Pentateuch today. Just real quick, just a few things that I want you to note. First of all, the big picture of those first 5 books is that it tells the story of creation to the time where Israel is on the verge of entering the Promised Land. Truthfully, we don't know what that time frame is. We don't even understand who wrote it, how it was written. We call these first 5 books the Book of Moses, and of course tradition says that, well, Moses wrote this. Well, Moses is a key character in these first 5 books, and likely there's a lot of it that comes and originates from Moses. There's several addresses that we get in the book of Deuteronomy, but Moses wasn't at creation. He wasn't an eyewitness to creation. The only one who was eyewitness to creation is God himself. So the account of creation that we get is from time before time begins, and it takes us all the way through the history of when the nation of Israel, the people of God, are getting ready to enter the promised land. It is a story of how human rebellion challenged God's design and desire. It's how God reaches out in the midst of rebellion, and he responds. In creation, God had a plan. He had a plan for humanity. He had a plan for us. And rebellion, sin, caused that plan to detour. And it's through God's response that we begin to see the story of these first 5 books unfold. There's rebellion and response. You have the fall of humanity at creation. You have the flood. You have Abraham and the establishment of the covenant with God's people, with his family. Then you have the Exodus, where a promise is being fulfilled, that they will be a people of God in a place, in a promised land. And God delivers them from captivity and brings them through the wilderness, and they become on the verge of entering into that promised land through these first 5 books. The big picture here is still, it's a story of a family chosen by God's grace that grew into his people. Well, let's look at Genesis. Let's start there and just begin to look at what the story of Genesis was. Of course, Genesis means the beginnings. It's a book of beginnings that demonstrates God's creation, humanity's role, the fall, and God's plan for redemption and restoration. Genesis has a simple outline. The first chapter through the first couple verses of the second chapter, we have the story of creation, how God created the heavens and the earth. Does it tell us exactly details? Is it a science book? No, it's not. This is a book that, in the end, God is the creator of all things. In fact, in the beginning, God is the creator of all things. And then through chapter 2 and chapter 3, we have the story of the fall. How humanity, through selfishness and self-centeredness, through the desires of their own, through temptations and succumbing to temptations, how mankind falls and disobeys God and destroys and detours his original plan for humanity. Chapters 4 through chapters 5 tells the story of various descendants of Adam and how now we're dealing with life in a fallen world, how humanity deals in relationships and how humanity deals with the fact that we live in a world that was designed where we would be able to commune with our Creator, that we would be able to live in the presence of our Creator. But because of our disobedience, that relationship was cut short. That relationship was hindered. And so the next couple verses, 4 and 5, talk about the descendants of Abraham. In chapters 6 through 9, we have the story of the flood and, of course, Noah, and how mankind disobeyed God to such an extent that he had to destroy it. But he still had that remnant of someone who believed and someone who was faithful and someone who could carry on the hope of restoration someday. Then in chapters 10 and 11, you have the arrogance of the nations, the Tower of Babel, how as mankind begins to grow and fill the earth again, they try to build a tower that reaches to God. They try to elevate themselves to a place of God, just like in the first few chapters of Genesis, where mankind wanted to be able to be like God. Again, it's only a few chapters later, and mankind is doing the same thing, trying to reach the heavens and be like God. And it's in this context that a man called Abram is called by God to believe and to have faith and to trust him and to go to a land where he had been promised a place. And he had been promised that his descendants would be a people. And in chapters 12 through 25, you get the story of Abraham and his family. And then 25 through 36 is Abraham's descendants, Ishmael, Isaac, Jacob. And in chapters 37 through 50, you have the story of Joseph. And again, you have this idea of Abraham and his family that is called to believe in God. And it's their faith. It's the fact that they, even in the midst of their failures from time to time, that they always had a belief in God, and God was continually reaching out and trying to restore a relationship through a family that he would bless all of humanity. God used their faith as the beginning of his resolution to the problem of humanity's rebellion. There are certain theological themes in Genesis. They begin and they come right out. We have it in the creation and who we are created to be. We're created to commune with God. We are created to cooperate with his plans and his purposes for our lives. Then there's the theological theme of rebellion and sin, how mankind fell. They destroyed God's original plan and purpose, and that communion, that relationship with God was broken because of our disobedience. And then God's response, that there was a desire for redemption and salvation. Through all of the stories, you have man's disobedience, you have humanity's disobedience, and God's response to extend an invitation for redemption and salvation. And this happens through covenant, his promises. It's nothing that we can do as human beings, but it's God's grace that extends to us to offer us salvation, to offer us redemption through his promises and establishment of a covenant. The covenants that God makes with Adam, Noah, Abraham, and Moses all point towards the ultimate covenant that we have in Jesus Christ. And so these theological themes we begin to see emerge in the Pentateuch. They begin to emerge in the book of Genesis. Let's move to the next book, Exodus. Exodus continues from Genesis and shows how God continues to bless Abraham's descendants, the sons of Jacob, even in a foreign land. They go to a foreign land. They go to Egypt as a refuge. God's hand is on them to protect them. But while they're there, they stay there. Eventually, the place of refuge becomes a land of captivity. They take it for granted. And again, they begin to take advantage of God's blessings and take them for themselves. But God's response is deliverance as he keeps his covenant promise. Over the years, God's people, Jacob's descendants, go from being at a place of refuge to a place of slavery and bondage and captivity. But God's response is deliverance. And we see that a theme of Exodus is deliverance and his covenant promise. We see the deliverance in the call of Moses, where Moses has been, first of all, saved from death, but when he was just a baby. Then he runs and seeks refuge out in the wilderness after he has killed a man. But then he sees a burning bush, and God reveals himself and reveals his name to Moses out in the wilderness. The call of Moses is God once again reaching out for an opportunity for deliverance, an opportunity for redemption, an opportunity for salvation through Moses, in and through Moses. We see deliverance through the Passover, through the release of his people as they get permission, reluctant permission, but permission to leave, that they are spared because of their obedience. We see the deliverance in the Red Sea, the walking through on dry land so that they could be saved. We see the covenant promises as they pass through the Red Sea and they go into the wilderness and they go to Mount Sinai in the law and the Ten Commandments. We also see God's covenant in the establishment of the tabernacle, a place where his presence, his glory would dwell with the people. So God's covenant promises that they would be his people, that Abraham's descendants would be his people and would be the means by which he would restore all of humanity, is there in the law and the tabernacle. And that is part of God's covenant promise. Exodus outline it begins in chapter 1, and of course it starts to recount Israel's enslavement in Egypt through chapter 2, verse 25. In chapters 3 through chapter 7, God raises up Moses to deliver his people. In chapter 7 through chapter 15, or into chapter 15, God delivers his people from bondage. In chapters 15 through 18, they travel from Egypt through the Red Sea to Mount Sinai, where God had called them to a place where he would be, and he would meet them there and fulfill his promise to establish his covenant in his people. Chapters 19 through 24, the covenant of Mount Sinai is given. The law is given. God writes on the tablets. God announces who he is and how he wants people to respond to his presence. Then you have the instructions and construction of the tabernacle in chapters 25 through chapter 40. Once again, the tabernacle was going to be the center of God's people. It would be in the center of their camp, and that's where God's glory, his presence would dwell, is where people would respond. They would bring their sacrifices. That is where they would meet with God. They would hear from God. They would worship and obey God at the tabernacle. After this, we really see that Exodus is the significant emphasis of the book is God's deliverance of Israel from bondage in Egypt and the covenant that God makes with his people, Israel, at Mount Sinai. The third book in the Pentateuch is Leviticus. In Leviticus, it's the instructions on how Israel is to worship God and live in the light of the fact that this holy God lives with them. Of course, the title Leviticus is addressing those that were descendants of Levi, those that had been called to serve in God's presence in the tabernacle. And so as God was living with his people, it's a restoration of what he had originally planned in the Garden of Eden, to be able to commune with his people, to be able to commune with his creation, and for his creation to know him and to be able to live with him. And God was going to live among his people in the tabernacle. His glory would be there. And so we have Leviticus starts out telling us how to respond, how to live in his presence. And so in chapters 1 through 7, we have the sacrificial laws, how we respond to a holy God, how we are supposed to obey, how we are supposed to learn and recognize who he is through these sacrificial laws. In chapters 8 through 10, it's the laws concerning the ordination of the priests. In chapters 11 through 16, it's laws about what is clean and unclean for God's people. The purity laws are contained within these chapters. And purity didn't have so much to do with sin as it did with being able to be in a right place to go into sacred space, into the presence of God. How we had to maintain purity to be able to go into the presence of God. In chapters 17 through 26, there's laws about holiness. Chapters 27, it's regulations about vows. Again, Leviticus recounts how we are to live in the presence of a holy God. A holy God was giving instructions for his people on how to live holy lives. The next book, Numbers. It's the people of Israel struggling with obedience and the consequences of disobedience. The Hebrew name for this book means in the wilderness. It literally is a retelling of the events that happen as God's people wander in the wilderness. The outline really is kind of a geographic outline of the first 10 chapters is the preparations to leave Mount Sinai. The next 10 chapters, chapters 10 through chapter 20, recounts the travels from Sinai to Kadesh Barnea. And then the next 16 chapters, chapter 20 through chapter 36 through 13, it's the travels from Kadesh Barnea to Moab, which is on the eastern side of the Jordan Valley, the Jordan River. It's not the promised land, it's to the east in the Transjordan. And so you have these geographic shifts. You have it really divided into three different sections: that preparation, the traveling from Sinai to Kadesh Barnea, which they were just on the southern tip of being able to enter into the promised land. But then they had to take a turn, a right turn, and go all the way around into the Transjordan and wander for nearly 40 years till they got to right on the edge in Moab, on the eastern edge of the promised land. The book of Numbers contains the census reports that Moses and the Israelites recorded while in the wilderness. However, the book describes the events that occurred during the nearly 40 years that Israel wandered in the wilderness between Mount Sinai and the plains of Moab and the Transjordan. We get the English name for Numbers from those census, but it really is about the events that happen in the wilderness. The final book of the Pentateuch is the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy summarizes and renews God's covenant as Israel is poised to enter the promised land. Deuteronomy, its outline, the first four chapters, chapter 1 through 4, verse 43, reminds God's people of his faithfulness. Chapter 4 through chapter 11, verse 32, talks about the mutual love that is the motivation for covenant. That it's God's love for mankind, for humanity, that we respond with our love for God, our love for one another, our neighbors, our love for those that are in need, widows, orphans, foreigners. This is all accounted for in Deuteronomy, that its mutual love is the motivation for God's covenant and for our response to live in covenant and obey God's standards. In chapters 12 through 26, it describes the laws that define this covenant life, how God's people are to live in covenant with himself, with God, and with one another. In chapters 27 through 30, it's instructions on renewing this covenant, this reminder of the covenant that was given on Mount Sinai. Now, almost 40 years later, they're renewing the covenant before they enter into God's promise. In chapters 31 through 34, it details the blessings that are to take place under the leadership of Joshua. And as they recount these blessings, this really is essentially a record of a series of addresses that are attributed to Moses. Deuteronomy is Moses talking to the people as his leadership. Because of some of the events that are recounted in the book of Numbers, because of those events, Moses is not entering into God's presence. It's only Joshua and Caleb from the original generation that get to enter into the promised land. And it's Joshua that's going to be leading the people. And Deuteronomy is essentially this record of these addresses that Moses is giving to the people before he passes the baton of leadership to Joshua. And Moses' addresses reveals a few things. First of all, God judges the world, but is also a loving father of humanity. God is doing something in his people, in this group of wandering strangers that are about to enter into their promised land. But he's doing it to bless the world because he's a loving father. Israel has privileges as a result of this covenant, but it also has responsibilities. God's people must obey. God's people must remember the covenant and live it out in their lives every single day. And Moses also said there will be a dismal future for Israel if they disobey and abandon the covenant. Essentially, the book of Deuteronomy is a bridge to the historical books that will follow the Pentateuch. It details Israel's adventures in the Promised Land. Once the book of Joshua unfolds, they are now preparing to enter into God's promise. And Deuteronomy serves as that bridge between the Pentateuch and these historical books that detail Israel's adventures in the Promised Land. Well, that's the Pentateuch. That's a quick overview. It's a bird's eye view. As you read it, I hope that you will see this pattern. I hope you will see these themes. Read through the text. As a matter of fact, one of the things I get the opportunity to do is I get to go into these lands. I get to travel the lands that the people that were chosen by God traveled those thousands of years ago. In fact, this is a picture of me riding a camel in Jordan, in the areas where they would have wandered and traveled through before they entered into God's promise. And we get to enter into God's promises too, through the new covenant, through Jesus Christ. God's final act of restoration was through his Son, that is, of course, recounted in the New Testament. But we will see how we get to Jesus and how we get to you and I, and how we get to be a part of that covenant through his covenant people in the Old Testament through the course of the semester. If you have any questions, please email me. My email address is on the syllabus. Hope you enjoy the semester. Like I said, keep up with the reading. There's a lot of reading. You have to wade through it, but it's so interesting. I hope that the Old Testament will come alive for you this semester.